concept is to drive these remotely controlled bodies called avatars. They're grown from human DNA, mixed with DNA of the natives.
Hello guys, and welcome to another video on Rewind Reviews. In this video we're going to be taking a look at one of the most highly anticipated movies of 2022, and that is the sequel to one of the biggest movies ever made, Avatar: The Way of Water. Written and directed by James Cameron and co-written by Rick Jaffa, Amanda Silver, Josh Friedman and Shane Salerno. In the sequel, Jake Sully lives with his newfound family formed on the extrasolar moon Pandora, but once a familiar threat returns to finish what he previously started, Jake must work with Neytiri and the army of the Na'vi race to protect their home. The movie stars Sam Worthington, Zoe Saldana, Sigourney Weaver, Stephen Lang, Kate Winslet, Cliff Curtis, Joel David Moore, Brendan Cowell, Jermaine Clement, Jamie Flatters, Britton Dalton, Trinity Jolie Bliss, Jack Champion, Bailey Bass and many more. The first Avatar movie was a pretty peculiar occurrence within the history of cinema, because this is a film that came out in 2009. God, that's 13 years ago. It was a bit of a game changer when it came to 3D technology within cinemas. This was kind of the movie that sort of sparked Hollywood to go, oh, every movie needs to be 3D now, and every single film that pretty much came out, all the big ones, it was supposed to be 3D. So there's a lot of movies that were kind of converted into being 3D, and they were never really designed to be 3D in the first place, so it always felt a bit strange. But there was a reason for that, because the first Avatar really did show what you could do with 3D technology within a movie. In terms of spectacle, the first movie was fantastic when it did come out, so much so that I will admit I did go and see it a few times in the cinemas. But when it was released on DVD, on Blu-ray, the extended cuts and whatever other versions there were, it was missing something, because now it was purely focused on the stories and the characters. It wasn't quite as investing as it once was. But Avatar fever was basically everywhere, and so many people went to go and see this movie so many times that it is the #1 highest grossing movie of all time. I mean, obviously the several re-releases and extended cuts and all sorts definitely have helped do that, but somehow this movie did manage to make it to that number. So it was guaranteed that we were going to be getting a sequel. Not only that, but at the time that the movie was getting released, they had the announcement that #2 was in development, they had the announcement that #3 was in development, and a 4th one, and then a few years later we got the announcement of a 5th one. So it really did seem like they were going to really sort of build this franchise up as much as they could. But with James Cameron being a bit of a perfectionist and the technology not being quite right, the release date for Avatar 2 just kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, to the point where now, 13 years later, it's actually released, and part of me is genuinely amazed that I'm even doing this review, because part of me never thought it would happen. It is a ridiculously long wait for a sequel, and it doesn't always pay off in the long run, because especially when it comes to the first movie, because of how much of a hit it was, it probably would have been wiser to release this movie a lot sooner to the first one, just to really sort of capitalise on it. So a lot of people, myself included, are wondering, is this movie coming out maybe just a bit too late? And I wouldn't say that's the case, but at the same time, I don't know if it's completely worth it. But before I get into this review, I do need to mention that I will get into a few more spoilery details here and there, but this is going to be as much of a spoiler-free review as I possibly can. If it was revealed in a trailer, in an interview or anything prior to this movie, then I'm fine talking about it. So if you don't want to know anything, you've been warned. So starting off with the cast for this movie, there are so many characters in this film, most of them actually coming back from the first one, but there's a load of new characters that are introduced in this one. Obviously we've got Jake Sully and Neytiri coming back from the first movie, who were the main protagonists of the first film. And even though, yeah, they are quite big parts of this movie, I don't feel like they're as central to everything that's going on. Obviously, what happens with regards to the main villain, they are a big driving force of that, but when it comes to the actual screen time, they're kind of put to the background a little bit more compared to their kids who are introduced into this one. But they do still give some really great performances, especially Zoe Saldana, who there are some moments in this where you're reminded just how good an actress she actually is. So I'm really glad that they were able to come back, and they really do knock out the park with their performances. And with the story now being focused completely on the Pandora storyline, and Jake is a full Na'vi now, the movie is more focused on the actual Na'vi rather than the actual humans. There are humans still in this, and they do play a part in it, but it is much more focused on Na'vi stuff. And that does allow for some pretty interesting decisions in this movie, because we have Sigourney Weaver making a return alongside Stephen Lang. Sigourney Weaver is playing a teenager. She's playing the daughter of Jake Sully, and there are reasons for this. There are reasons why they brought Sigourney Weaver in to play her, and it is addressed, but it is very fast. But I suppose with the technology that is sort of included in the movie, you can sort of see how. It is definitely a bit strange, and I feel like if you are used to Sigourney Weaver as she is now, you probably are going to pick up on it a little bit easier. But like, the voice is still quite deep for a teenager. They do mask it as well as they can, and I do feel like what it is that they did with the actual motion capture performance, I do think that it is sold well. I do think that Sigourney Weaver is integrated into this quite well, and there is a reason for it, and I do appreciate that they do try and address it as much as they can. And similarly, when it comes to Stephen Lang, he's returning into this movie as the exact same character that he was playing in the first movie. He is the villain once again. The big difference this time is that he is an avatar, and there are reasons for it. They do explain it, and I'll buy it for what it is, but it can feel a little bit cheap considering that there is potential for other villains to be introduced into this, and I feel like just bringing him back just for the sake of it is a little lazy. But they do address it as much as they can, and it does give an actual personal motivation for what it is that he's doing. So I do like the angle that they did take with it, but I am still conflicted on how I feel about it. And then when it comes to a lot of the newcomers in this movie, I feel like they are integrated very well into the story. I think that they are very naturally introduced, because some of the main characters that were introduced to early on in the movie are Jake and Neytiri's kids, and this does goes to show just how far ahead this movie's kind of jumped in time. There's a really good montage early on where they sort of like catch up on everything that's going on Pandora, so I am curious to see if when the next movies come out whether they're going to do a similar thing or not. So it is a really good way of catching people up without making it sort of feel a bit too expositional, because it does kind of do a similar thing what they did in the first movie where they've got Jake narrating everything. But that's why I think it's a little bit strange why Jake is still sort of portrayed as the main protagonist of this movie, where I feel like he doesn't have as much screen time compared to the kids, who to me are much more prominent in this movie. And that also goes for a lot of the new characters introduced from the Water Tribe, including Kate Winslet's character. There is so much that's going on in this movie, and of course it is 3 hours long, so they have got enough time to really sort of go through these characters and sort of show who they are. And just like a lot of the returning characters, I do feel like the performances from everyone who is involved in this movie are great. I really do think that every single performer is really good within their roles. But I will admit, when it comes to actual like character beats and arcs and a few plot threads and things like that, it's very similar to what they did in the first movie, almost to the point where it is a little bit predictable, because there are a lot of elements that are carried over from the first movie, like the learning of the ways of the natives, the war that's brewing between the Na'vi and the humans, the environmental message, the romantic subplot, even right down to the villain and a lot of the locations that they get to visit. There's a lot that is brought in from the first movie, so it does feel like it does kind of retread a lot of old ground. There are definitely attempts to try something a bit different, especially when it comes to Jake and Neytiri's characters, because they are now parents and they're now having to look after their kids and all the pressures that come along with that. So I feel like that's something that I do appreciate them adding into this. But when it comes to a lot of the younger characters, they do kind of go through a very similar transition that the older characters did in the first film. One thing that I do appreciate in this one a bit more is that, unlike the first movie, which is very focused on world building and showing off Pandora, this one does actually have a slightly more personal story. It is much more focused on the characters and their struggles this time around, even though there is definitely a lot of world building in this one, especially when it comes to the oceans. But it is much more a story that is sort of built around the family more than anything else, and it does make it a bit more personal. It can have a few emotional moments. I won't go so far as to say like a teared up or anything like that at a few moments, but it is there and the potential for it is there, and I feel like if you are somebody who really is caught up in it, I feel like that is the experience that you will get. But like the first movie, there is definitely an environmental message that is trying to be conveyed in this movie, and it is always difficult trying to integrate a message like this into a big movie because a lot of movies don't really know how to balance that and the story. This one has done it quite well. I do feel like it is integrated very naturally into the story. When it comes to the runtime for this film and the overall pacing, I know a lot of people were put off by the runtime for this movie, and I can understand that because it is long and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to sit through, especially if it is a movie that is very long. But when I say a movie is very long, I mean more like the pace of the movie. For this one, I feel like the pacing is just right. I don't feel like it's too long, but at the same time I do feel like there are elements that they could have shortened down on a little. It's a slow builder. It takes its time, so it sort of builds up the elements that it does need in order to get going, so it does feel warranted. I couldn't necessarily say this could do with being cut, this could do with being cut or trimmed or edited or something like that, because everything does feel necessary. So much so that I am kind of questioning if there is an extended cut of this movie, because it feels like everything really is in it. But then again, I also felt the same way about the first movie, and it turned out there was like an extra like 10-15 odd minutes for it, so I definitely could see that being the case in this one. But at the same time, I feel like this is just the right length of time for this movie, and I really don't know what else they could have done to really sort of either make it longer or shorter. But then the question is, does it have the payoff that you're expecting based on all this build up going on throughout this movie? And like the final half, like the third act of this movie, every single thing comes into play in this. Every single little thing that has been sort of built up until that point does come into play in some way, and it is spectacular. The final act is absolutely brilliant. It's really well done, and I do feel like that is really worth seeing on the big screen. It isn't necessarily just limited to like story beats and things like that, it's limited to character beats as well and character arcs, which also culminate into this. So I feel like it is handled very well, and I do think that it is executed in the right way. But as I said a little bit earlier, it does feel predictable. You can kind of see certain things happening, but it doesn't really take you out of it. You do get sucked into it, and I do think that it is handled well enough that you don't really sort of question where it's going. And on a side note, I mentioned in my trailer talk that there seems to be like a lot of little callbacks to a lot of earlier James Cameron movies, and there really are a lot in this movie. It really surprised me how many references there actually are. I don't know how deliberate a lot of them are, because there are definitely references to things like Terminator, The Abyss, even Titanic. There's so many little Easter eggs and references from previous James Cameron movies that are in this, almost to the point where it does feel like this kind of is a culmination of everything that he's worked on over the years. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the best James Cameron movie that's ever been made, but I think in terms of how it's made, I feel like this is definitely one of the better ones that he has done. I may not necessarily be his biggest fan, especially recently after like all his superhero comments and things like that, but when it comes to his movies, especially action movies, they are really great movies, and the action that is featured in this is genuinely spectacular. It is very well handled, it is huge, it is absolutely amazing to see on the big screen. It's able to balance so many different elements that are getting thrown into this at any one time, and you never feel like you're sort of missing out on anything that's going on, because everything is being shown and given enough time. There's also some pretty tense sequences as well, because there are a lot of underwater sequences, so of course people can't breathe underwater, obviously, and there are sequences where that is utilised to really build up the tension. Like there's a really nasty monster attack, and there's a character who's trying to sort of like get away from it, and is sort of like trapped underneath all these rocks and everything, and air's running out and everything. It's really well handled, and it taps into a fear that I didn't even know I had, but I do now. Well, there's that, and then there's floating away into the darkness of space for all eternity, so there's some parallels between them. Although the ocean one's got a bit more of a possibility of happening. The action is genuinely good. It's surprisingly a lot more brutal than I thought it was going to be as well. I mean, it is within PG-13 12A rating restrictions, so it doesn't go too far, but there are definitely a few moments where I did get a little reminded of things like Lord of the Rings, where it is kind of brutal, but you can kind of get away with some of it. Like, there's nothing too nasty, but there are definitely a few shocks here and there. I'm going to talk about the effects in a second, but one thing I do want to say really quickly is the format that I went to go and see this movie in. I tried to do it in IMAX 3D. I did see it in IMAX, but I didn't get the chance to actually see it in 3D because my lovely cinema's projector wasn't working properly, so they couldn't do it in 3D. So I do want to do it in 3D because I do feel like that is something else that is added into this, and I feel like these are like the very rare 3D movies that are genuinely worth seeing in 3D. They really do provide a very immersive experience. You are transported to another world, and I feel like trying to be immersed in it as much as possible is a really good idea. So I know there are a lot of people who probably just want to wait for this to come out on Disney Plus or digital or whatever format it is that you want to see it on home release, but I honestly would highly encourage you to go and see this on the big screen at least once, and if you can, try and do it in 3D, and if you can afford it, try and do the IMAX 3D. I did enjoy it in the format that I did see it, but I do want to at least try and get the full experience with 3D, so if I can, I will try and see that by the end of this year. So when it comes to the effects in this movie, in one word, brilliant. On a technical level, this movie is genuinely amazing, almost to the point where I'm not quite sure how some of it is actually done. When it comes to the first movie, the effects, especially how it looks today, it does still sort of hold up enough, but you can tell that it is CG. I do feel like it hasn't quite aged as well as I feel like it really could have. Well, maybe that's just because I'm used to it. But when it comes to this one, I think the effects genuinely do look very good. They are very believable. The motion capture technology has really come a long way since 2009. So much so that I think there are definitely a few sequences in this movie that do kind of feel like they are sort of thrown in this just to sort of show off that they can, and quite similar to what they did in the first one. But there are definitely a few sequences where I was just watching this thinking, how the hell are they doing this? Like, there's one character who's introduced into this movie called Spider, and he's like one of the few humans that's actually within the Pandora setting, so I don't know how much of his stuff was in like a green screen studio and how much of it was actually on a set, because he does sort of interact with things here and there, so they probably did have to build some sort of set. And even though he does have a part to play within the story, as I said, it does feel a little bit predictable where his character is ultimately going. It does feel a little bit like he's in this just to kind of show off the technology. It's more so just how he's interacting with the Na'vi and just how he's operating with like all his surroundings and everything. So it is done very well. It is really well done. And then when it comes to the Na'vi themselves, like the technology that is used to bring them to life is really good. And the one thing that I do really like about them is the designs of the characters, because they do still feel very similar to what they were in the first movie. But the water tribe who we are introduced to in this movie are actually quite different, especially when it comes to their biology, because they are sort of like integrated into the water environments. So there is differences within how they look compared to the Na'vi that we were introduced to in the first movie. Got like a slightly paler blue skin, they've got like all these like tribal tattoos all along the faces and arms and everything. And then when it comes to like the sides of their arms and the legs, they've got like almost like this fin sort of look to them to help them swim, and the tails sort of changed as well, so they actually look like a bit more like an actual fin. So I do like that design choice, and I do like how it is addressed in the movie. It does feel very believable, and I like how it is integrated very naturally into the film. And that goes for a lot of the creatures that do appear in this film, because this is quite similar to when it comes to like Star Wars, where it does feel like this is an already established movie or an already established place where these characters have been, and it does feel like this is a very realistic world with the way that the characters and creatures are. There is a lot of thought behind why creatures look the way they do, how it is that they interact within their environment, how they hunt, how they operate and things like that. It is very well done and it is very believable. I really do appreciate that attention to detail, because it really does help immerse you into this world so much more. I've managed to make it this far without talking about it, so let's talk about the water technology. The biggest focal point of the marketing for this movie, like way before the film was even released, was the water scenes and what it was that they were going to be doing with regards to how motion capture was going to be used to try and record water, and how the actors would be able to actually act within this water environment. I said in my trailer talk that there's there's no reason why they couldn't have just had like the actors strung up on like harnesses and just have them like pretend to be underwater. But at the same time, I can see why it is that they've done what they've done. It does make it very believable. I do think that the way it is done is very good. It is very well handled. I love how the technology has advanced to the point where this is now possible. There are a lot of sequences that do take place underwater, so a lot of the actors did need to practice a lot of those breathing techniques to try and help them breathe underwater for a long time. And apparently Kate Winslet has actually shattered Tom Cruise's record, and I think she was underwater for like 9 minutes. But things like that are integrated into the story very well, and it does help this sort of feel a bit more natural in the way that they are trying to sort of like change these characters to evolve to this new setting. It is really well done. I feel like a lot of the underwater creatures that are introduced into this movie as well, they are integrated very well. I do like how they do look, they are presented within the film, they're very believable, they're very realistic. As I said, the movie does have a very environmental message, and one of the messages that they are trying to address within this one is whale hunting and the cruelty of it all, and they do that very well. There are sequences where it is a little hard to watch, but it is handled very well and it does prove its point. There are some really good sequences and I really do like how they are incorporated into this, because when it comes to the actual like water sequences, there are times where, you know, obviously yes, they are underwater, they are swimming around, they are interacting with the creatures, but then there are characters who are in boats or on creatures that can like fly across the surface and like dive underneath like whales do, and it is really good. And I feel like the sequences involving the boats, I don't know if they were filmed in a studio or not, because they're that well done, they're that believable, I really cannot tell. But one thing that was a little bit 50-50 on is they've got these gigantic whale-like creatures that are introduced, and the Na'vi that live within the water tribe are able to go underwater and they interact with them and they like tell them stories and talk to them, but like the whales are sort of like talking back to them. Like if you haven't seen the movie, like they don't actually like talk, but it's just like the sounds that they make, and then there's subtitles that sort of answer what it is that they're saying. I don't know how I feel about that, because I feel like you could just sort of show the whales sort of like reacting to it rather than like having them have like a full-on conversation, because like there is a level of believability in this and I feel like that might be just a tiny bit too much. I do understand why it is that they are doing it to an extent, but I do feel like there probably is better ways that they could have done it. And now that I mentioned it, there is actually a scene really early on in the film where you see like a lot of the characters interacting and talking, and it's all in the native Na'vi tongue, so it's all with like subtitles. And then there's a scene where Jake's like, well, since you're here you might as well hear it in English, and then it snaps and then everyone's talking English from that point on. And part of me kind of wondered if like the whole movie was going to be in like the Na'vi language, and I feel like that could have been an interesting direction for them to have been in. I suppose I might have taken away from a lot of the visuals in this movie, because like if you're trying to be absorbed into it but you're constantly having to read subtitles, it can get a little bit distracting, so I can kind of understand why they did it. It would have been an interesting decision for them to have done, but I'm not sure if it would have worked 100%. So back to what I was saying, the water technology that they have introduced into this movie, what they've been able to do with the motion capture within the way that it is now able to be recorded underwater very believably, very realistically, it is really great. I really do like how this has now been established that you can now do this. I'm really looking forward to seeing what it is that you could potentially do with this in the future. Back when James Cameron announced that he was going to be doing the sequels to the first Avatar movie, one of the things that he initially said he was going to do was have neytiri, possibly other characters going off to other planets and exploring those. But he felt that there was so much to Pandora that hadn't been explored that he thought that the better idea would have all the sequels take place on Pandora and have them travelling across and exploring different locations. So when it goes to the location that they've gone for with this movie, they've moved out of the forests, out of the mountains and the sky. They're now on like this beach in the middle of all these islands, and it looks beautiful. They're absolutely amazing. They're really taking full advantage of the location of this movie with the way that the environments and the sets are integrated into this water beach location. It does help separate it enough from the first movie that it doesn't feel like it's repeating anything. Like, you do visit the same locations that you did have in the first movie. As I said, there are definitely a lot of throwbacks in this, but this one does try its best to try and shift away from that location, and we do get a really great idea of this new place. And honestly, with all this talk of space flights now being potentially available to the public, the one place that I really want to go now is Pandora. You know, TripAdvisor, huts on the beach in Pandora. Huts on the beach, that sounds like a really bad Star Wars parody. But honestly, it does genuinely look beautiful, and I really think it does look very different from a lot of things that we do normally have in a lot of films nowadays. I did wonder, with a few more modern movies that have been coming out over the past few years, like Aquaman and Black Panther, which have focused on underwater cities and sort of like locations set around the ocean, how many parallels there were going to be to those movies. And there's not many. There is definitely a few overlaps here and there, but it does feel very much like its own thing. It doesn't feel too repetitive from other things that we have had. The location, not the story. Simon Franklin takes over composing duties for this movie. He's the one who created the score for The Way of Water. He's taken over from James Horner, who very sadly passed away a few years ago. And a lot of those themes that were introduced in the first movie are carried through into this one, and they are not necessarily recycled, but they are sort of like replicated in a way that it has evolved, it has changed a little bit, but the main themes, the main core themes are still there. It really is a beautiful soundtrack. I really do love how it sounds. It really does emulate this environment that you are in. And then with the introduction of the new characters and the new places and locations, there are a lot of new themes that are introduced into this, and they do feel very natural from what we got in the first movie. The themes are carried over into this, and it does feel like a very complete soundtrack. You could listen to the whole thing, 1 and 2, and it would feel like a complete soundtrack. The Avatar themes, I don't think are the greatest themes ever created, but I do feel like they are iconic, and I feel like they are very recognisable, and I'm really glad that those themes are reintroduced in this one. It really is a beautiful soundtrack, and if you can, I would highly recommend having a listen to it on its own. Overall, even though I will say that this movie is predictable, it does borrow a lot of elements from the first movie. It is still a visual spectacle. I did find myself invested in the story and the characters and what was going on, even though I do feel like they could have developed things just a little bit more. I do think that visually this is so immersive. This is an absolutely brilliant big screen experience, so I really highly recommend seeing it on the big screen if you can. This is a very simple story. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a deal breaker for me, because there are some brilliant movies that have got very simple stories, and I do feel like this does try and do some things a bit different compared to the first movie, but it is still very, very similar at times. So I do feel like they could have done just a little bit more with either the characters or the story. Is it better than the first one? That is a bit of a judgment call. I, in some instances, would say yes, but in others I would say no. I feel like the first movie had a slightly more better understanding of how to integrate the story and the world building together, whereas this one feels a little bit more personal, and the way that the message and everything is integrated into this story feels a little bit better. But it is definitely a personal preference, so I really can't say which movie is better, because they both have their strengths and weaknesses. So with all that being said, my rating for Avatar: The Way of Water is 7 out of 10. I really was debating whether or not to give this an 8 out of 10, because there are definitely a lot of elements that really do warrant an 8 out of 10, like the effects and the technology that has gone into making this movie, but it is still very simple, and I feel like there could have been a lot of improvements here and there. But it isn't a bad movie at all. It is a very good movie, and I will highly recommend checking it out if you can. I really, really urge you, if you do want to see it in the cinema. I've got to be honest, where this movie sort of leaves off, without getting into spoilers, I am very curious what it is that they have got planned for the next 3 movies, because I don't really know what else they can really sort of do. They have announced that the 5th movie is going to be taking place on Earth. I don't know if maybe that's one too much, because I really don't know what else they can actually do. A lot of this movie was repeating the story from the first movie, so is that going to be the case for the next one? Is that going to be the case for all of them from this point on? I really don't know. One prediction that I do have is the potential locations for where 3 and 4 will take place, and I feel like maybe the 3rd one might end up being like frozen wastelands or something. Might sort of tie into the way that the water is in this one, with like the sea levels rising. It sort of sticks with the environmental message. It'll also be quite different enough from what we've seen in the first 2 movies. It would feel very different, and then maybe with the 4th one it could be like a desert or something like that, again, it'd feel very different from what we've seen before. There is definitely a lot of potential for what they could do. I just really hope that the stories are improved just a bit more and they're able to do a lot more with them. And the other biggest worry is I really hope that this isn't just dragged out for as long as possible, because they are stretching things out just a bit too much at this point, and I am worried that people are going to get a bit fed up, because this is going to be something that's going to happen like every 2 years. With the way that this movie took so long to be released, I don't know if people are going to be as invested in seeing another 3 movies after this one. So we'll see how the reaction is to this one. I mean, at this point in time, it's almost grossed like $500 million worldwide, so there's a possibility, but I highly doubt that it will make the same amount as the first movie, so we'll see how that goes in the next few weeks. So that is everything I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like, subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on this channel. If you've seen the movie, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Also, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you want me to do, whether it's film, TV, games, let me know down in the comments and I will try and get around to them one day. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.